Good morning and welcome. This is the Hawaii State Senate. It's November 8th, 2024, and I'm pleased to report that this is the first official legislative proceeding of the 33rd legislature. This is a joint informational briefing that we'll be featuring today between the committees of Commerce, the Senate Committees on Commerce and Consumer Protection, Public Safety and Military Affairs, and Energy, Economic Development, and Tourism. We have 3 hours scheduled where we will be featuring an informational briefing on wildfire safety from Hawaiian Electric Company, followed by question and answer. I'm Jarrett Kehokalole. I represent the 24th Senatorial District, which is Kailua and Kaneohe on the island of Oahu. And I am the lead chair in this briefing. And because this is the first proceeding of the new legislature, I think I'd like to start by having the Senate members who are in attendance introduce themselves. We are in the process of reorganization, and while chairs have been named, committee members have not. But as is our customary protocol, any sitting member of the Hawaii State Senate can sit in on any proceeding. And so I'm happy to have our fellow chairs here as well as the Senate members. So we'll start on this side, Senator Lee.
Good morning and aloha. Chris Lee, Windward side.
Good morning. Brenton Awa, Windward and North Shore.
Good morning. Lindy Coit, Molokai, Maui, Lanai.
Aloha, Glenn Wakai from Kalihi to Waipahu.
Good morning, Samantha D. Court, Waianae Coast.
Okay, thank you very much. And with that, I'll turn it over to Hawaiian Electric. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Senator. Check. Aloha and good morning, chairs, vice chairs, members of the committee. My name is Jason Ben. I'm the Senior Vice President, Chief Transformation and Administrative Officer for Hawaiian Electric. With me today is Colton Ching, Senior Vice President of Planning and Technology. Colton is leading the development of our wildfire safety strategy that we'll be filing in January with the Public Utilities Commission. And also with me today is Kurt Tsukiyama, Director of Transmission and Distribution Operations for Maui and Hawaii counties. And Kurt is based on Maui. He was instrumental in leading our response and recovery efforts in Lahaina and upcountry. Some brief remarks. Our number one priority for the past 15 months has been reducing the risk of another catastrophic wildfire in Hawaii. We know a lot more, and we've done a lot more since our last briefing, and we really appreciate the opportunity to come before you today to update you on our efforts and our plans going forward. As you'll hear shortly, we've made significant progress in reducing the risk of wildfire ignitions from our equipment. We've brought in experts and partnered with other utilities to leverage best practices and take actions that have the biggest impact, but also consider cost effectiveness. By the end of the year, we will have invested $120 million on wildfire safety and resiliency measures, and we anticipate spending another $300 million over the next 3 years, offset by $95 million in federal funding grants that we've received. We know we can't do it alone. While we're proud of the leadership we've demonstrated, we're grateful for the partnerships we've built to address wildfire risk as a whole of society issue. Today, there is an unprecedented collaborative effort underway by many people in Hawaii: utilities, landowners, government agencies, first responders, neighborhood organizers, private business, academia, and dozens of nonprofits like the Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization are all working together to defend against the threat of wildfire by making communities safer and ensuring we have the personnel and resources in place. Our investments, as you'll see, in AI cameras and weather stations are helping to improve situational awareness and preparedness for everyone, including first responders and weather forecasters. We were also able recently to leverage our federal funding to create fire breaks at Lehoku Elementary and Waianae, and look forward to similar projects in the future. Importantly, we now know the amount of the settlement and what our company's share is. While there's still some issues being resolved in the court, we will not be asking customers to pay 1 cent of our nearly $2 billion portion of the global settlement, should it be approved. Our company and its shareholders are paying for it, and we've already taken steps to finance it, as evidenced by the recent sale of more than $500 million in stock, which will be used to pay for the first of 4 planned installments. Finally, we appreciate the support and feedback we received last session We heard you, and we are addressing your concerns. Cost to customers is always top of mind, and we continue to aggressively pursue federal grants and loans to offset the impact to our customers and communities. We are developing simpler legislation designed to ensure expedited relief for property owners in the event of a future catastrophic wildfire, while providing our investors the necessary confidence to finance essential utility investments in safety, resiliency, reliability, and clean energy at the lowest possible cost of capital to our customers. One of our rating agencies recently spelled it out. Long-term credit improvement and stability for HECO depends on legislative and regulatory outcomes that support their financial health and efforts to enhance wildfire safety. Mahalo again for the opportunity to be here today, and for you taking the time to be here today. We have a lot of information to share with you, and I'd like to turn it over to Colton Ching now to take us through the presentation. Colton.
Thank you, Jason. Good morning, chairs, vice chairs, and senators.
Colton, if you'll
Sure.
pardon me before you get started, I'd just like to allow our vice chair to introduce herself since everyone else did.
Oh, Carol Fukunaga, District 11.
And then also for those watching online or who are rewatching on YouTube, a copy of this presentation will be made available on the legislature's website, on our committee page, and also on the YouTube video that will archive this presentation. Thank you, Colton. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So as Jason mentioned, we've got a lot of material that we want to share with you today. But I want to start off with some key takeaways from the material we'll be presenting over the next 45 minutes or so. One is that wildfires are a societal and economic threat requiring many lines of defense. It requires all of us to work on this. Utilities like Hawai'i Electric, we understand that we have a very important role with that, but we share that the role and the need to address it with many other folks who are working very, very hard on this. Like Jason mentioned, we're going to be spending about $120 million this year, specifically on wildfire mitigation work. That represents about a third of our total budget for the year. We've had to make some tough choices on the other important things that we do at Hawai'i Electric in order to afford this $120 million. But this is how important it is to us to reduce this risk as quickly as possible. The good news, and I'll get into it a little bit later, is based upon the work that we started at the end of last year and continue to do this year, we believe all of the operational changes, all of the new procedures we put in place, the hardening we've done, the vegetation work, trimming work that we've done over the course of the last year and a half or so, we believe we've reduced wildfire risk of ignitions caused by utility infrastructure by 60%, a 60% reduction from what we estimate the level of risk to have been prior to the Maui wildfires. But we're not stopping there, right? We are developing a wildfire safety strategy. Folks in the mainland and the industry call it a wildfire mitigation plan that we're developing to set course of the efforts that we want to prioritize over the next 3 years. But long-term, beyond the 3-year period, as part of these new risk tools we're creating as part of our strategy, we're setting a target to reduce wildfire risk on the 5 islands that we serve by a total of 80%. And I'll get into some material that explains that. And then lastly, but definitely not least, as Jason mentioned, just want to reiterate that the Hawai'i Electric Company and our shareholders, as Jason noted, we're going to take responsibility for our share of the Maui litigation settlement. It's been covered quite a bit in the news, but we'll talk about it a little bit at the end of our presentation. So if we created this slide to give hopefully a clear hierarchy and organization of all of the wildfire mitigation work, all of the things we're doing to reduce wildfire risk since the fall of last year, and including all of the things we're looking to do over the next 3 years. And you can think of the work we're doing in 4 broad categories. The first is foundational work, things that we're doing to replace equipment with more fire-safe equipment throughout our areas of higher risk, doing things like collecting data, doing ongoing vegetation work, all of that kind of ongoing stuff that we will continue to do year after year. That's one category, and we'll talk about those things. The second are operational changes. Changes to how we operate the grid, changes to the settings of our automated systems, and things like our public safety power shutoff program. Things that we're changing, not in the grid itself, but how we use it and how we set it. The third is situational awareness, right? And so these are things like video cameras deployed out in the field where we can see areas where ignitions could take place, and so we can detect as early as possible and share that source of data with others, including first responders. It also includes things like weather stations, which are placed right on our circuits, so we know exactly what kind of weather conditions, what wind speeds, what level of humidity our circuits are experiencing at that moment. And then something called fault current indicators, which we'll talk about later, which will give us an idea of what's happening on our system, so we can quickly address any problem that may be occurring throughout our 700 or so circuits that we have. And the last category is grid hardening, and this is the kind of stuff that maybe people automatically first think about when you think about wildfire mitigation work. So this is things like taking a pole designed to a lower strength or wind speed, and replacing it with a stouter pole that's able to withstand higher speeds and have higher strength. Replacing our power lines, the wires on our poles, with ones that are sturdier and stronger, less resistant to breaking under high winds or when they get hit by vegetation. And other things like undergrounding, using some new technologies like covered conductor and things like that. All of these four categories of work together, and we'll be talking about all of the things we have done and the things we plan to do over the next 3 years in the construct of these four broad categories. But in total, right, like I mentioned at the beginning, we're looking at about $120 million of investments this year for things that are foundational, operational changes, situational awareness, and grid hardening this year. And we plan to make significantly more investments over the next 3 years. So for those of you who like numbers, and I'm an engineer, and I'm one of them, what we're showing here in this table is just so you can see through the different four categories and the different initiatives that represent each of the four categories, how much we're spending this year for each of those initiatives. And we're spending monies in each of those categories. Some of the initiatives cost more money than others, and so we're really not just doing it to spend money, but we're doing it to get the effectiveness that each of these initiatives can give us and the roles that they play. So here's a map of Oahu, right? And if you stop and think about all the kinds of work you need to do to reduce wildfire risk, the first most critical piece of information that you need to do a good job in mitigating that risk is first having a clear understanding of where your risks lie. What areas have higher levels of risk and what areas have lower levels of risk. And the state has risk maps that accounts for every source of ignition, right, including utility ignition sources, and looks at holistically that risk across all of those potential ignition sources. What we needed at Hawaiian Electric was a risk map that focused on risks of utility infrastructure ignitions causing fires. So we worked with a national expert, an expert who's been working with utilities in the mainland as well as with states on this very topic of wildfire mitigation from utility infrastructure. And they used their expertise, looked at a lot of local data, satellite data, data from the state, to then create these maps. And so this map of Oahu shows in red the areas of Oahu that were identified as having the highest risk. In yellow, you can see that medium risk areas. And the experts can talk about it in much greater detail than I can. But the risk maps are based upon the infrastructure that we have at Hawaiian Electric, this looking at past outage data across all of our circuits. So it's actually looking at the performance of each of our 700 circuits across 5 islands. It then looks at what fuels are within the area of our circuits. And some fuels will result in ignitions more likely turning into fires. And then some fuels will cause fires to spread more rapidly than other types of fuels. So they looked at the fuel inventory across the state and included that in its risk assessment. And then it factored things like terrain, the prevailing direction of winds, and then on the downstream end of those factors, looked at what communities, what critical facilities were located in the likely path of a fire should there be ignition at that point. And they used all of these factors to determine high, medium, and low risk areas. So this is the high and medium areas in red and yellow for the island of Oahu. Here are the high, medium, and low risk areas for Maui County. And this is a map showing the high, medium, and low risk areas for the Big Island of Hawaii. So coming up with those maps, identifying where our areas of greater and lower risk are, then drove our priority in doing a fundamental foundational thing, which is to inspect our infrastructure, identify what's out there, what condition our infrastructure is in a much more enhanced way than what we typically do as part of our routine inspection work. So here's a few examples of our folks and contractors performing inspections. Here's a visual and boring example on the left where we're doing a bore into a wooden pole. In the middle, you can see the use of, it's called Thor's hammer. It's a sound-based device that can basically read what's happening on the inside of the pole. And Kurt is going to show and share with you an example of what the Thor's hammer looks like. It's a hammer where you pound a pole with the sensor, and it actually records the sounds that's being picked up by the transducer to tell our inspectors and engineers what the condition of the inside of the pole is like. And not just where you're hammering it, but throughout the pole, bottom, from underground to the top. And on the right, you can see it's a little small, but you can see some drones being flown. And we use our drones regularly to perform visual, mostly visual with video cameras, but also infrared and other spectrum imaging, so that our inspectors can see the condition of not just the pole from the ground, but can see close up the condition of things like cross arms and insulators that typically sit at the very top of the pole that are much easier to see from the top with a drone like this. So these are the kinds of technologies and processes and procedures we use to perform our inspections. And you can see in this map, in purple, the circuits in the areas that we've performed inspections to date. And these inspections that we're doing need to continue, right? They're gonna always happen, but we did a very, very concerted, high-paced, high-volume effort to do inspections in our higher risk areas. And here you can see to date where we've done those inspections. This doesn't mean, this is not all we're gonna do. We're gonna continue to do them, expand to other areas, but these are the areas we've done so far. One of the things you do when you identify your high, medium, and low risk areas is then to prioritize your vegetation inspections and vegetation trimming or vegetation management. Vegetation trimming is very expensive. It takes a lot of time to do trimming around energized lines. And so we use those risk maps to help us determine where do we prioritize the work. The image on the left just gives you an example of how tricky and difficult and sort of careful you need to be to do trimming. It's not just felling a tree from the ground at the trunk. It's trimming the branches up high and ensuring that the branches, when you trim them and they don't fall into our lines. And so it requires a lot of climbing. In this case, this guy is suspended by a rappel line in order to do the trimming. The image on the right is an example of a typical challenge that we have with our infrastructure In this case, this is a photo from Maui. You can see we have 2 circuits on a pole line on the right-of-way on the side of a road. I think this is a state highway. But you can see vegetation growing from the adjoining properties outside of the right-of-way, starting to encroach within our easement or the right-of-way, including encroaching upon the power lines up at the top. And so this was later trimmed back quite a bit. I think Kurt's folks cut back about 20 feet in from that. But we typically cannot do that for a right-of-way or easement. We can typically only trim within that right-of-way or easement itself, right? That's typically what we're limited to doing. And we'll need to work with a landowner on that property, on adjacent property, if we feel we need to do trimming further back. But that's really at the discretion and the decision of that landowner. Vegetation is a major safety and reliability issue for us. I think we can all think of instances where we've experienced high winds and rain that in combination causes tree branches to fall off into our lines, or the wet ground to cause an entire tree to topple over. And it's during those more extreme weather events, it's the #1 cause of outages. It's not anything else other than vegetation making contact with their infrastructure, often breaking it, like shown in this photo here. We spent over $100 million over the last 4 years in vegetation work. Not just for wildfire mitigation, although that's been a big piece this year. We do it all over the 5 islands that we serve to keep vegetation at bay and away. Things like albizia trees and eucalyptus trees make it really, really challenging. And in a lot of cases, we have to do much more trimming because these trees are very, very big. In some cases, we have to remove complete trees to really get it out of the way. We're doing a lot of partnerships with many, many different organizations, government as well as private, where we can, where we have a common interest into having a tree removed or tree trimmed. We try to work with them to do that so we can get the trimming done without having as much of an impact to our customers. And like I mentioned earlier, typically, without that cooperation, all we can do is trim within our easements or right-of-way. There are county ordinances that allow or that provide the county to require private property owners to do trimming. In the county of Maui, for example, the Maui Fire Department has issued notices to landowners, property owners, to do trimming for safety purposes. But at Hawai'i Electric, as a private utility, we don't have that authority, right? So we can't ourselves tell a private landowner, hey, you've got a tree that's in our lines, you need to cut it back. Well, we have to cooperatively work with them on that. Okay, so that's vegetation work. Again, another example driven by our risk maps. A really important pair of foundational pieces that we're doing, we have done, we're gonna continue to do over the next several years, is to replace a fuse. So just like the fuse in your car, or if you have an older home, a fuse box at your home, we have fuses in our electric system, and it has the same purpose. It's there to protect equipment and our customers from a power surge. And the fuse, like the fuse in your car or in your home, it works by sacrificing itself, right? If there's too much power flowing through a fuse, the fuse is designed to fail. It breaks. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the fuses that are used by the utility industry, when that fuse fails, it can sometimes create embers, molten embers that can then become an ignition source. So we're replacing our traditional fuses that we have of that design with fire-safe or sparkless fuses. And so Kurt, if you can show the senators some examples of both the old and the new fuses. They function in the same way. It's just that the fire-safe fuses, when they fail, when they go, they don't create hot embers or sparks that can become an ignition source.
Yes. So this is a typical, what you see in the picture, right? This is what we call a cutout, and this is the fuse itself. And typically, when there is a fault or a disturbance on the system, what will happen is, as Colton mentioned, this is actually what we call the door, and inside of this is the fuse itself. And as Colton mentioned, when there is a surge, it will sacrifice itself and fail. Conventionally, what typically happens is a lot of energy, right, occurs. I mean, you might hear sometimes when it sounds like a shotgun blast. Sometimes people think, right, it's so loud and violent that they think the transformer fails at times. But really, it's just this fuse going. And you know, you can look it up on YouTube, but you'll see demonstrations where, by design, not only the physical nature of the amount of energy when this goes, but also, right, the embers that Colton mentioned. And so by design, it'll pop. You'll see some embers that might emit from the bottom side of that. So this is typically from the field what we install. The new fuses, this is one, it's called an ELF. And it's not only by design, it's fast acting. So it reacts quicker, so that the energy that typically would make this fuse activate and blow, this acts quicker, so the energy doesn't get as high, and so hence you don't have, when it does go, you don't have that violent shaking, and then you don't have as much heat and intensity coming out of it. And then also by design too, physically, it minimizes those sparks or those embers that will come out. So this is one, we're using this in certain applications because this actually fits right into our existing cutouts. So there are certain applications that we're always trying to look at what is the most cost-effective way, and even like for myself, right, operationally, what makes most sense, and it's always trying to manage that balance. And so in some instances, we can still reuse this cutout, and then we're just putting these new fuses in. However, there are certain applications whereby, because the manufacturer of this only makes it to a certain size, we're not able to use this in all cases. And so then in other cases, we are having to replace the cutouts with these new style cutouts, and then these are the new fuses. Similar functionality in means of mitigating the fire risk there. So these are the fuses and the cutouts. And then they're kind of heavy, so I'll probably just leave it here. You can check it out later.
Thanks, Kurt. So here's a couple of photos of the cutout and the fuse installed. So typically they're installed on cross arms at the top of poles, often around, the most common one you'll see is the one right next to or above a pole mounted transformer. So this table here shows what we've done in the last year or so, a little over a year, in replacing fuses, the traditional fuses, with these fire safe fuses. And we plan to do quite a bit more next year and in 2026. We do believe by the end of 2026, because we believe this is an important fire risk mitigation component, we want to get as much done as we can, including where we need to change out the cutouts. And so we're trying to get this done over 3 years. So we're trying to wrap this up in 2026. And in our high and medium risk areas that we showed in the maps, get all of the fuses that are there replaced with these fire safe fuses. Lightning arresters is somewhat similar in concept to a fuse, in that it's meant to deal with the surge, but a lightning arrestor is really meant to deal with the surge in voltage. So just like your surge suppressor at your home that's meant to deal with a surge in voltage to protect your computer or other devices, we have a lightning arrestor that uses some of the same technology inside to provide that protection against a surge in voltage. By its name, you can see that one of the uses of a lightning arrestor is to deal with a lightning strike, which is very, very high voltage, hitting our lines, and that high voltage transgressing throughout the rest of our system and then damaging equipment. The lightning arresters will stop the voltage at the arrestor, but like a fuse, a lightning arrestor, in doing its job, can sometimes, in absorbing the energy, fail and fall apart, and that can also be an ignition source. So Kurt will kind of show you an example of old and new.
So this is, again.
So,
Oh, yeah.
I don't know how we can really account for this, because if you got to stand to talk, then I can certainly understand, because this stuff is heavy. But if at all possible, maybe we can move a mic so that
sorry
the
about that.
people
Yeah,
can
no,
hear you,
No problem. I apologize.
because this is interesting stuff. Thank you.
Yep. Oh, so yeah, this is a current lightning arrestor. This actually recently came out when we replaced it. And as Colton mentioned, right, if you imagine this device is on our system, protecting for safety, equipment, and the grid itself. And so imagine a lightning strike. This device, and there's material inside, is intended to basically absorb all that energy. But that energy got to go somewhere. And so by design, you'll see it blow out. And that energy, again, imagine that energy from a lightning, right? And then it's being balled up here and it has to blow out somewhere. And so when it does blow out, it does, again, emit molten embers, sparks, right? Very violent activity as well, too. So we're replacing, and this is also ceramic as well. What we're replacing with is something like this. This is the lightning arresters, and it does the same function, but the main difference now is because we have this added portion here, this piece. And this is basically just like an energy absorber. So like, as I mentioned, where it's evacuated out through here, this is designed to absorb that energy and not have again, that same emission of embers, sparks that's coming out. And what you'll actually see that we like operationally is like through the expulsion of the energy is like a paper tag that then will trickle out like a ribbon. And so for us, it's when we're running the lines, it's easier to see and find what happened. Because sometimes you might see this up here and I don't know, right? We're trying to find it and we can't find it. But at least with this too, it not only helps quench, I guess, that energy coming out, but at least for us, a visual indicator of like, oh, okay, look like that, like lightning hit this lightning arrestor out there. So yeah, these are 2 items.
Thanks, Kurt. And so in this slide, similar to our fuses, our fire safe fuses, we want to front end this work. We're looking to do the bulk of this work this year and in next year, and wrap the replacement of these lightning arresters with safe ones, ignition safe ones in 2026. Here's a map showing the 3 counties and where we put in. There's many things in here, a couple of things in here, but focus on the yellow dots. These are areas where we put in, so far, replace fuses and lightning arresters with the fire safe ones. So moving on to the next category, which it gets into operational changes. So we've talked about fast trip and block reclose in our last info briefing. This is the concept of making an operational change where when our protection equipment, our automated devices senses a problem with the circuit, it shuts down that circuit much more quickly than the normal setting. And on top of that, where our typical configuration is that when a problem is detected, because the majority of the time that problem is momentary, like a mylar balloon hitting a line or a branch brushing a line, it goes away after a second or so. Our circuits are programmed to automatically re-energize after so many seconds. It's called reclose. So the big change we made immediately after the wildfires last year was to deploy this new configuration of having circuits trip much faster and not trying to re-energize that circuit after it detects it. It stays completely de-energized until someone manually re-energizes that circuit. That change required us to go to those automated devices, the protection devices, and either replace them if that equipment was not able to be reprogrammed, or to reprogram the ones that were there if they are able to be reprogrammed. And so this image here at the very top, so this is a panel within a substation. At the very top is sort of this kind of rectangular box, has a little screen, and it says SEL. That's a good example of our current substation relay. It's basically a computer in there, a PC in there running a very specific software application, and it actually can control our high voltage devices. So we program into this relay these settings that will trip a circuit very, very quickly. And we've done it to over 200 circuits, but this is an example of the work that we needed to do to enable this operational change. And with the deployments of fast trip and block reclose to date, we've done it again in those areas of highest wildfire risk. And you can see in here the circuits in the different colors across the 3 counties. Not the circuits, but the areas that those circuits cover in these maps. And so you won't see a blob over all of the red or all of the yellow, because in a lot of these places we may not have any of our infrastructure or customers served in it. The other big operational change we've made is to enable a program called Public Safety Power Shutoff. So the fast trip and block reclose are reactive operational changes. It has to first detect a problem on the system in order to then respond. Public Safety Power Shutoff is to, when certain conditions exist, preemptively shut off power to a circuit before a problem occurs. And this ensures additional safety beyond and in addition to a fast trip and block reclose. So we developed it not just within Hawai'i Electric, but in working with many, many different county and state agencies and other infrastructure owners. We've held over 60 community meetings to ensure that the customers we serve are aware of this program. Those in the areas affected by public safety power shutoffs will know why we're doing it and can understand what to do when we make different announcements. We'll talk a little bit more about the cameras and weather stations, but those things are instrumental pieces that we've added to our system to enable this public safety power shutoff system to work well. And we've had this program in place in July. We have 2 instances where we've activated the program, which means we stood up our emergency response, but we have not yet shut off power to any circuit. But going to the activation, going to the notifications, continuing to meet with emergency agencies throughout the state, we're continuously improving the program in how we operate it, and as well as how we communicate what we're doing with the program with our partners as well as with our customers. So I wanted to give you an example. So this is something we created. This is not the actual dashboard, but we have a dashboard that looks really busy, so we made the simplified version just to help communicate the fact that we look at every single circuit that is part of our public safety power shutoff program, real time, using those weather stations that I'll be talking about later, where we monitor the wind speed, the wind gusts that the circuit is experiencing. We monitor the humidity that the circuit is experiencing. For those of you that participated in that tour on Maui, you got to see some of those examples of the weather station. They're like mounted on a pole on a distribution line or transmission line, so they're right there. And we have a team of folks that are activated. They are looking at our dashboard. They're looking at both wind speed and humidity and are making the determination if whether we've exceeded both of those thresholds. So you need to exceed both a wind and a humidity threshold, one upwards, one down, right? And if you exceed those thresholds, then we shut down power in that particular circuit. And this is a rendering of October 16th, where in case for Maui, we got really close. You know, when we first activated, we thought pretty sure that we were going to have to shut off power this time based upon what we were seeing in our weather stations and what forecasts we were receiving. But fortunately, and this is actually not the worst scenario, but this is an example where we got really, really close. So this is what we do every single time we activate. Also, when we activate and we say we're going to stand up our emergency preparedness, we activate our communications with our customers and stakeholders. So we invested in a new tool called message broadcast that's targeted towards our customers that are within our public safety power shutoff areas. And the tool communicates out to customers in these areas through multiple channels. They send them texts, they'll do an automated phone call, they'll send them an email, and it measures and monitors who's reading their text, who's opening their email. And and people have an ability to call back if they don't pick up the phone, right? So if we can monitor all that, we can do repeat messages in case we miss someone so that we can improve the chances of getting that communication out. So it's a really good tool to ensure that not just we're notifying people, but we're getting to them. These messages are getting to them. One part of having our customers prepare appropriately and respond appropriately for a PSPS event is the education that happens prior to an activation. And so this is some information from surveying we've done. The awareness of our customers of PSPS has increased significantly from back in May when we started. So in our last survey in October, like on Maui County, 73% of those surveyed were aware of our PSPS program. But you can see it for each of the counties. Level of understandings are a little bit lower than awareness, and you can see the survey results here. But they're all trending in a positive direction. They're all increasing. So there's more work we need to do here, but we're glad that we're seeing this increase. So I mentioned video cameras with artificial intelligence. These are some images of what the camera looks like. It looks like a pretty typical security camera, but it's very different from what you see sitting in front of Costco or a Walmart. On the right here, you can see some examples of a camera on Maui up at Kaheava, actually detecting and boxing in here. It's really hard to see, but we'll have a video to show you. It's actually picking up smoke on South Maui, across the bay. And it's monitored 24/7 through our contractor, Alert West. Here's where we deployed our cameras. So the camera deployments are based upon not putting them right next to our infrastructure. We want them placed where they can see where ignitions can occur and have a broad view of where they're located. But they are located in places where they have good views of areas of greater risk from either one side of the mountain ridge or the other. And living in Hawaii, we all know that there's so many ridges here. We have to place cameras in locations because you can maybe see up a valley from one side, but you can't see it on the other side. So we've strategically placed our cameras in these locations. Chief Todd from the Big Island has this quote in here. I won't read it, but I think the Big Island Fire Department is just an example of all three counties whose fire departments are making great use of the video cameras. They have access to it. They can not just view it, but they can actually control it, zoom it, change the direction that it's zooming in on. Some really good capability. So here's a live feed, and I'll need to swap to it. So this is a live viewing from the camera system. And any of you can actually go to this site. I'm logged in, so I can actually control it. But I'll use, since this is a nice clear photo of a mountain, right? So this is Keaumoku on the Big Island on the west side.
Just for the edification of the members, the
Yeah.
website is what?
The website is alertwest.live. And we can send it out to all of you after.
Thank you.
Yeah. And you can see in the left, by example, at Keaumoku, you can see the view of the slaying camera. On the right, you can see how that red line moves around. It's following my cursor, so it can give you a map to say, here's what you're pointing to. This, on the map, this is what you're looking at. And then we also have a 360-degree view, so you can always be monitoring the entire area surrounding it. So this is located at our substation, so you can see our substation on the left. But I can, if I want, if it's gonna cooperate with me, I can zoom in, I can change the orientation to look at a different area. It's not cooperating with me now, but I can do that as someone who has an account with it. And our local fire departments across 3 counties have that capability. So that's one example, but you can see on the map on the left, all of the cameras that we have located. You can pick any one, or you can pick it off of the video menu on the right. Any one that you want to look at and focus on it. So Mikilua on Wai'anae, Senator DeCourt, maybe you're familiar with this area, right? So this shows in here Lualule, the fields where the radars are located. So these are some examples of what our cameras are able to do. Okay, so nothing's going on today. Good news, knock on wood. Want to show you a video of, sorry, Senator?
No, is that live video or pictures?
That was live.
Live video.
What I showed you was live imaging.
Live feed.
Yeah, live feed.
Okay, thanks.
What I'm going to show you now is a recording of a live feed of an actual fire that our cameras caught, and one in which we then notified, this is on Oahu, we notified HFD. So this is in the Eva area near Campbell Industrial Park. So this camera is up on the hills by Makakilo, I believe, and it's looking down. So it's really zooming in to see this, but it was able to detect and pick up the smoke and is tracking it. And you can actually see here now where HFD is throwing water on the fire. So this is a sped up feed. It actually spans 45 minutes of time, but we're able to capture events like this. We'll do notifications of the Alert West will notify our folks. We'll notify the HFD as well. Say, hey, look, our cameras are picking this up. A lot of times they see it themselves first because they're using these cameras themselves.
Can I add one quickly?
Sure.
In case you missed it in the beginning, the camera, that's part of the AI part of it. It detected it as it's spinning around, and it zoomed into it. And like Colton said, it's a little faster than real time. It's sped up, but you'll see the truck arrive. And so integrating with the emergency response. And this particular fire was not related to our equipment, but yeah, just so in case you missed the beginning, that's really the good part of the function. It's gonna pick it up. It's gonna alert us via various notification mechanisms and the department. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jason. So for video cameras, we've deployed video cameras in the end of 23 and 24. We're looking to deploy another 32 next year. And based upon the data we have right now, we think that will complete the different places we want to deploy cameras. But we're always looking at new technology, and new cameras come out that may have new capabilities. And so we're going to continue to be looking in the future to see if there's a benefit for adding new or different forms of cameras. Weather stations. This is a couple of pictures showing what a typical weather station looks like. There are many pieces to it. There's a box that's located lower with the sort of the brains and the communications part of a weather station. There's a solar panel and battery, so it's powered up. And then there's a rain gauge and anemometer that determines wind direction, wind speed, mounted typically higher, mounted on an arm coming off of the pole. But we locate it right where infrastructure sits so that it's measuring what's happening right where our circuits run. So this is an example of what it would look like. If you drive around safely as a passenger, you'll see this throughout our islands. We've done a lot of deployments. In this case, they are within areas of the highest risk, so this map shows where they've been deployed to date. We had a wildfire safety strategy meeting. Derek Rowe from the National Weather Service gave a presentation on the work that they're doing on fire risk and weather forecasts to support wildfire response. And he really expressed appreciation for the for the weather stations that we deployed. Every weather station that we deployed, although they're put in for the purpose of monitoring what's affecting our infrastructure. That weather data is public. Anyone can take a look at it. It's added to the University of Hawaii's MESONet, so other organizations like the University of Hawaii, like the National Weather Service, now have access to significantly more weather stations than they had last year. And these weather stations are going to help them do a better job and improve their ability to do things like determine when to issue a red flag warning, and to do it on a more granular level, you know, in an area or by island versus statewide. And so we're really happy that others are actually making use of the weather station data that we have right now. So I'm going to share with you a live feed of the weather stations. So this is Maui. You can see this is West Maui, parts of Lahaina. So this is a measurement of what wind speeds are being seen at. It's a live data feed. There's a slight lag in getting the data, but it's pretty real time. So you can see out here in Laniopoko, there's not a lot of winds. This is one of our weather stations, but you can see out here, it's gusting at about 32 miles per hour, right? So rather than relying on a few weather stations, maybe like at Kahului Airport or a place like that, to try and understand what's happening in different parts of the island, we now have weather stations that give us a real clear indication of what's happening in the area that we're focused and concerned about. And again, this is information that everyone can have access to, so we'll send you also the link to the MESONet. Shoot, sorry. So unlike cameras for weather stations, we do want to deploy significantly more than we have today. We've done 53 so far, and you can see here in our plans over the next three years, the additional weather stations that we want to deploy across the 3 counties. We ultimately want to end up with about 250 weather stations in total across the 5 islands that we serve. And I think before we started in this effort, there was less than 50 weather stations deployed in the 5 islands that we serve from all different sources that were used by folks like the National Weather Service for their work. The next thing I want to talk about are fault current indicators. So this is another example of situational awareness. And this, unlike the weather stations and cameras, this is really mounted directly on our infrastructure, and it tells us when it detects a problem on our system and in which direction the problem is being seen from. So circled in red here on the pictures are examples of it deployed. Very hard to see unless you're looking for it. It basically, it looks like a Pokemon ball mounted to a conductor. And Kurt is passing out an example. So you can see centered on the blue side on the bottom, that's where it clamps onto the conductor itself, and the clear side faces down. And when it's energized and activated, if it detects a fault, it'll tell you which direction the fault is coming from. And so by locating these in strategic locations, our first responders are able to more quickly determine where a problem may be happening, so we can address it, more quickly address the risk that may be out there, and then if there's an outage associated with it, restore power more quickly.
Sorry, like Wi-Fi capable. Those ones are just like look at it.
Yeah.
So these are not. These are just locally. They don't have a radio in them.
But we have some that do.
Yeah. And you may already see these out there on our system, but as Colton was mentioning when he was talking about some of the operational changes, right? Talked about fast trip and things acting quicker response. So likewise, our legacy units, they did not have that capability. And so hence, because from an operations standpoint, right, we're still keeping the lights on. And so when we go out there, right, we deploy more of these, and these also are on a quicker cycle, so they will accommodate in terms of some of the changes that we're making on our circuits to operate quicker. So that's hence to why we're putting more out there.
And then this slide shows what we've done to date in replacing or adding new fault current indicators or FCIs so far, and then what our plans are for the next 2 years. And this is another category or another initiative where we're looking to do rapid deployments of these FCIs for the reasons that Kurt explained really, really well. We plan to put a lot out there, as you can imagine, and the more we put out there, the more granularity we'll have on where a problem is occurring. Because the smaller section in which you can bracket FCIs to say where they're pointing toward each other, to say, I see the problem in this direction, and this one says, I see a problem in this direction. The closer they are together, the shorter the section Kurt's crews will need to inspect to figure out and really determine where the problem occurs. Okay, I'm going to now shift to hardening. And I'll start off with the use of stronger poles. And so here are some examples of images where we've replaced existing poles with stronger ones. On the left, you can see crews installing a wooden pole to replace an existing wooden pole, but you can see that wooden pole that the crews are hugging and picking right now is much thicker, much bigger in diameter than the pole next to it that it's replacing. So this is a use of a wood pole to replace an existing wood pole, but the new wood pole is much stronger. In the middle on the right shows some of Kurt's crews installing a new steel pole. And they're long, they're big, so you can see them picking it up. On the right, you can see them addressing, doing installations at the top of the pole. For those of you that were on the tour in Maui, this is along Mill Street where we stopped and looked at where we had both wooden and steel poles along that alignment. But this gives you some images of what that looks like and what it takes to install it. These new poles that we're putting in to replace existing poles, these poles are designed to National Electric Safety Code. This is the code by which the Hawaii Public Utility Commission requires us to design poles to. What I will say is we use those standards as a minimum, right? So when we put in one of these new poles, it doesn't mean it's designed just to the National Electric Safety Code. We typically design it to a strength above that because we want to account for, the fact that these poles are going to be here for a number of years, right? And it will get weaker over time, right? And so to ensure that over its life it maintains that minimal amount, we typically design it to a much stronger design than what the code requires. Here's where we've done pole replacements. These pole replacements are done in areas where we have a higher wildfire risk. You can see in some places we've put them in places where we don't have a red or yellow area, and that's because we developed our new utility-specific risk maps earlier this year, and prior to that we were using the state DLNR maps, which looked at all hazards, all causes of ignitions, and so we had done some installations in areas that were identified high back then. So we do plan a number of pole replacements. We've done a lot. We plan to continue to do more in 25 and 26. For 2027, we don't have numbers to share right now because it's largely going to come about from two things. It's going to come about from what our inspections tell us that's ongoing now, and it's going to come from something I'm going to be talking about in a little bit in the future called covered conductors. And that's a key part of our strategy going forward. And when we replace a traditional power line that's bare with a covered conductor, that adds more weight, adds more of a sailing effect, wind resistance. And so we know we're going to need to replace poles as part of that work to make sure that the poles are strong enough. So we have no specific set of pole replacements, standalone pole replacements identified in our strategy at this point. So as I mentioned, and Kurt, maybe you can start sharing the conductor material. One of the things that we have been working on is to replace certain materials, certain types of our power line conductors specifically copper-based conductors made up of a single strand of copper versus like a multi-strand, and replacing them with a multi-strand aluminum conductor, which is much stronger, tougher, much more resilient. And so you can see by example here, some sections of copper conductor we actually removed. So there's a lot of patina, a lot of corrosion on the outside. And we've been replacing them in sections with aluminum. And Senator Lee has an example of a couple of multi-strand aluminum conductors that's replacing the copper. And this map here, I'll let you guys look at it for a second.
I apologize there.
Yeah, so this map here shows those areas where we prioritize and focus the replacements of copper conductors with aluminum. And here's a plan of work that we have done as well as what we're planning to do over the next 3 years. These numbers here are in miles, so the number may look low, but these are miles of conductors being replaced. Now you see in 2027, it's blank, and that also ties to the next thing I'm going to be talking about, which is covered conductors. So I'll talk about the strategy a little bit later, but one of the preliminary results of the risk modeling we're doing and the strategy that we're developing is that a very cost-effective way to reduce wildfire risk in our high and medium risk areas is to replace our traditional power line materials, which were those bare aluminum or bare copper conductors, and replace them with a power line that's insulated with rubber or a polyethylene material, like what the chair is looking at right now. And it kind of looks like an underground cable. It works just like an underground cable. It just doesn't have the same kind of insulation. But the insulation works in the same way. By being insulated, if a tree branch makes into contact with it, if the insulator breaks and the conductor falls off of the pole onto the ground, the insulation will protect the electricity in the conductor from making contact with a grounding source, like a tree branch or the ground, and then causing an ignition. So that's how it works to reduce risk. Here's some examples of different forms of covered conductor. If you're not looking for it, it's kind of hard to see. It's still mounted on a pole. It still typically will have a cross arm, not always. The one on the left doesn't have cross arms, they're bundled together. But in the middle, you can see that it looks a lot like traditional overhead construction. And in the right, you can see what it takes to do that install, right? So here's one of our crew members doing the covered conductor work. This is in Olinda, where we stopped by in the Maui visit. So very preliminary, our strategy is calling for this covered conductor. And this is why we're showing replacement of copper with aluminum winding down, because eventually we want to go to this covered conductor material. And we're showing on a very preliminary basis where on Oahu we believe it makes good sense, good use of funds, and makes significant risk reductions by deploying covered conductor in basically the west side of Oahu. It's about 150 miles in total that we want to do. That's a lot. We also want to do it on Molokai and Maui, about 250 miles worth across those two islands, so significantly more than Oahu. And for both Oahu and Maui, these are largely in the areas of those islands with the highest wildfire risk. And on the Big Island, we've identified about 400 miles of covered conductor to be installed in a combination of high and medium wildfire risk areas. Again, what we actually filed with the Commission in January may differ slightly from this, because we're still working through the analytics, the data, and using our subject matter experts to refine these deployments. But in total, we're talking about almost 800 miles of covered conductor to be used to replace the traditional open, bare conductors. Now, we can't do 800 miles of covered conductor in 3 years, and it takes us time to create the design and permitting packages to do this work. So we're planning to begin the actual replacement or the actual deployment of covered conductors beginning in 2026. We believe we can do about 50 miles per year with the resources that we have, and with the hold-offs and the other requirements we need to support it. So we won't get all of this done, of course, in the next 3 years, but we really want to hit this with as much of an effort as we can. And right now, we're estimating that to be about 50 miles per year. The other and last hardening option that we are looking at is undergrounding. And I want to note that right now, just over half of the distribution lines on the 5 islands that we serve are underground already. We are working specifically and very focused with residents of Lahaina as part of their overall community rebuilding effort to understand what the residents of Lahaina want, what the community wants in an overall rebuilding effort, so that we can figure out what's the right role for undergrounding in that. But we're struggling to figure out what that right role is for undergrounding in places like Lahaina, because we don't know exactly what the plans for Lahaina are just yet. And really that will help us determine what's the right areas and right uses of undergrounding for that community. Undergrounding, in the picture on the right, gives an example of the ditch, for lack of a better term, that you need to dig up to do it. By example, manholes that we need to lay in. And so it gets pretty invasive when you think about putting undergrounding in a place that's already built, right? A place where there's already homes, already streets, already sidewalks, already water, wastewater, telecom lines on the road. If you're gonna convert from overhead to underground in an existing community, it's a lot more expensive and a lot more challenging than building it in a brand new community that is basically a field right now, where you can lay this stuff in without all that stuff in there. And as Henry Curtis so astutely pointed out to us in a working group meeting the other day, you also have to replace how you serve every single customer coming off of that line, right? Every service connection. That today might be an overhead service drop, like it is in my house, to that weatherhead on your roof, to now digging a trench to every home, having that customer relocate their meter panel for underground service. So there's a lot of work involved, and there's a lot of costs associated with that. So we think it's gonna cost about $11 million per mile and many years to get permits to do retrofitted undergrounding for overhead communities versus the $1 to $1.5 million per mile for covered conductor installs. But we do see, right, a role for undergrounding, especially in areas where there's added risk of blocking a road, added risk of, there's an extreme fire risk in here, and undergrounding provides the level of reduction needed to reduce that risk down. But we need to figure out precisely as we wrap up our plans in the rest of this year what the role of undergrounding is. And then we need to factor in, for the undergrounding we identify, how do we do it in a way that addresses the many permitting, many of the environmental, many of the cultural issues that come along with doing a lot of undergrounding work. So that's the last hardening category. We've not figured out just yet how much undergrounding we want to do. We know it's not gonna be a lot given the value that we're seeing from the operational changes and covered conductors, but we know that there will be undergrounding to be done. We just don't have that figured out just yet, but we will have it in our filing, in our strategy I keep saying at the end of the year, by January 10th, when we're required to file it. I want to transition now to talk a little bit about the ongoing work we've done in planning out our system for wildfire reduction and the many discussions and conversations we've had with the broader community around it. And I'd like to start out the discussion by sharing this slide, which comes from Elizabeth Pickett from HWMO. She shared this slide with us in a presentation that she gave at a symposium that we held to kick off our process to develop a strategy for reducing wildfire risk on HECO's infrastructure. And what point she made in here is that wildfire risks come from working in 3 major areas. It comes from reducing the frequency of ignitions that starts a fire. And this is largely the role that Hawaiian Electric has, reducing the risk and likelihood of utility infrastructure becoming an ignition source. But she astutely pointed out that doing that alone is not enough, because you're going to have ignitions coming from a number of different things, right? And no one can make something completely ignition proof. Even the utilities in California have been doing wildfire risk mitigation work for 10 years, have not eliminated the risk of ignitions coming from their infrastructure. I think PG&E had over 2,000 ignitions from the infrastructure this year. It's a lot. But we need to work on it, right? But we need to work on other things as well. And so she pointed out that reducing risk from a societal standpoint means managing lands and reducing fuels, right? Making sure that the amount of fuels that can take ignition to become a fire and make that fire spread quickly can be reduced. That risk can be reduced through management of that land. And then third, which is the thing that I think many of us tend to forget about, is there's a really important role of making our communities and our neighborhoods safe. And that includes things like using good construction materials, fire-resistant construction materials, building homes to good building codes, managing the vegetation on our individual properties. Elizabeth talks about making sure that we don't have dried leaves sitting in our gutters, right? You may have good fireproof materials, but if you have this ignition source in your gutter just ready to go, you're defeating the purpose. So there's things that every individual can do to manage it. So this is a good reminder to us, and we're thinking about our role in wildfire risk mitigation through this lens, knowing that we can generally focus only and have a direct impact on the ignition. We're trying to see how we can help with other areas as well. And so actually I'll get to it later, on that one example. Elizabeth also talks about how everyone has their role, and I kind of covered in the last slide, right? So it's land stewards, it's residents in every single community in our areas of greater risk. It's policymakers like you, it's our community leaders, our neighborhood boards, it's emergency responders, right? The state and county and federal emergency responders and the emergency agencies that go along with them. But it's also folks like us, utilities, developers of land use planners. We all have a role in adapting all our areas of responsibility, things that we administer and things we own and control, adapting it for this very different environment that we have. So one really good example of where we're trying to not just focus on utility infrastructure, but partner with folks where we can to reduce the risk overall, where there's still going to be benefit to us, right, from a utility perspective, but has a broader benefit to communities, is the work we've done in conjunction with DHHL, with the Department of Energy, to create a fire break just outside of Lehoku Elementary. And so in this image here, you can see at the top what the invasive grasses look like before. It's green in this photo. I guarantee you it's not always green. It's often very brown. And on the bottom, you can see the same locations after a fire break was created. So we removed these grasses. The plan is to replant, not just trim it, continuously trim it forever, but to replant it with native species that will not cause or create the same fire spread risk and maintain basically a fire break capability. But we took advantage of a federal grant, and so we were able to get the feds to pay for half of this work. So we're trying to find opportunities like this on different islands as well. There's a link here, it should be in your packet, where you can see a video where folks from many different community organizations that were involved in this to talk about this project. So onto our strategy itself. I mentioned that I shared the two of the slides that Elizabeth presented. These are some photos from a symposium that we held in Hilo. We had about 100 people in attendance, folks from the federal government, state government, county, first responders, emergency agencies, regulators. You had landowners, nonprofits, you had other utilities and infrastructure owners. And then we all got together in Hilo at Imiloa to learn together from experts in the field who have been doing this work in other places. So we heard from utilities in California, utilities in Puerto Rico, regulator in New York, utility in Australia, of what they have been doing, what they found successful, what have been their failures in reducing risk in their own areas. And every area has different kinds of wildfire risks, but they were sharing their experience. And we had all of us had an opportunity not just to hear what they have to say, but interact with them, ask them questions, and together we learned quite a bit. That really kicked off our process to develop a strategy using these stakeholders as participants to help inform us as we develop this. The webpage that you see in this slide is an example of a public-facing page. We can all get access to it that shows, that shares publicly and with the stakeholders the materials that we've worked on with them. So presentations that we've held, we've conducted, it's all there for anyone to take a look at. The meetings we've had, summary notes of those meetings, they're all located there, all accessible for everyone to take a look at. We've conducted these meetings since April. We just had our last meeting, which is a deep dive into our model. What is today? Friday. So the meeting was on Wednesday, 2 days ago. I believe that was our 6th meeting that we've had with stakeholders. So we continue to have a lot of interest from folks in these meetings. One of the things that we developed as part of our strategy, so the first thing we talked about was developing utility infrastructure specific risk maps. The second thing we developed is called a wildfire risk model. The risk model determines for every one of our circuits on the 5 islands that we serve, based upon the historical performance of the circuit, where the circuit is located, the fuels that surround it, the communities that are downstream of those circuits. We take all of those factors in historical weather and use all of those factors to determine the risk of ignition and the probability of a consequence measured in dollars of damage to structures and damage to acres of land being burned by a potential fire based upon that probability. And we do it in fairly small grid increments so that we can take a look at the risks associated with every single circuit on our system. And then we can look at it by circuit, we can look at it across for the entire 5 islands that we serve. And when we look at it across the 5 islands that we serve, we can model what we've done. We can model all the things we've taken action on, the operational changes, the hardening work that we've done, the PSPS program that we put in place. And we can use that risk model to approximate how much of a risk reduction we've been able to achieve with the work done to date. And that's what this chart shows here. It shows that prior to our accelerated mitigation work in the fall of 2023, that level of risk is shown in the blue bar, the blue column. And with the fast trip and block reclose operational changes, with the PSPS program that we put in place, with the changes and improvements we've done on our transmission system to date, and then the hardening work that we've done on our distribution system, each of them represented by one of those orange waterfall blocks. Today, we believe we have a residual risk that's about 40% of what it was in the fall of last year before these measures were implemented. So that's a significant 60%, about a 60% reduction in risk. And that was actually a little bit more than what we expected to get. But it's very consistent with the experience that the mainland utilities have also experienced. Those have been working on this for a number of years. The operational changes of Fast Trip and PSPS, especially the California utilities have implemented, they have experienced and have calculated similar levels of risk reductions as we're modeling here. And they have many more years of operational experience with these functions in place, so they actually have empirical data to support this. So it's very consistent with what they've identified. So that's one sort of learning and product that we've had so far from the risk model that we developed. The other aspect of the risk model that we developed is to then, using that risk model, have the model consider different options of work that we can do in the future. And we can do that to do a couple of things. First, we can do that to understand what is the trade-off between further risk reductions we can achieve with an approximation of how much of a cost is associated with achieving that additional risk reduction. So this chart here tries to show that. You can see the red dots. Let's focus on that for now. That's the base case. So that's with the base set of solutions, the amount of risk reduction, incremental risk reduction you get, and the amount of investment that goes along with it. So risk reduction, you're reducing risk more as you go to the right, and the investment needed to get that risk reduction is on the y-axis in millions of dollars on the right, on the left. And you can see as you make further risk reductions on your system, so this is in total for all 5 islands, there's a fairly small investment you need to make significant risk reductions. This is beyond what's happened to date. This is why it starts off at about 60%. Whoops, sorry. But as you continue to make investments and increase the reduction in risk and reduce the amount of risk that remains, getting that next increment becomes more and more expensive. And you can see under this base case, it really starts to have a hockey stick effect as you get to about 80%. And so I've circled in orange the 80% because that's what we're targeting in our strategy. Not to say we want to get an 80% reduction in 3 years, but our longer term goal is to get that 80% reduction in time, that we want to at minimum achieve that as a target outcome. In addition to the red line, you see a number of other colors in here. These are different scenarios that we ran, different cost assumptions, different solution sets as part of mitigating that risk. And you can see that they begin to diverge when your overall risk gets to about 75 to 80%. But when you're working on reducing risk up to that point, 75%, the different scenarios really all are kind of the same. So what that tells me as a planner is that the mitigations are not so dependent upon some of the assumptions you're making, that you're still going to get good results even if your assumptions of cost and the relative effectiveness of one solution over another differ from what you assumed. We also ran a scenario, because we often get asked this, why don't you just underground everything? So we said, okay, let's restrict the model to only pick undergrounding at $11 million per mile as the mitigation. And what would that look like? And so that's the curve, that's the scenario with the blue diamonds in here. You can get the risk reduction, but it comes at higher costs. And we actually, it goes off the chart in here. It ends up being at about $10 billion of undergrounding in order to get to about 80% risk reduction. So it's not to say we're against undergrounding. We know it just comes at a price. And although we don't believe undergrounding everything is a solution, we do believe that there is a role for undergrounding in very specific cases where there are benefits in addition to just the pure wildfire risk reduction levels. And then sort of my last slide before I hand it over to Jason. in the last info briefing, we had a lot of discussion around finding ways to get funding to help us to do this work from the federal government. And we talked about it then. We've done significantly more work since then. So this table shows just a listing of the federal grants that we've gone after that are focused on resilience. And the vast majority of this are wildfire risk reduction related resilience work. We've gone after a lot more federal grants, but this is just a list on resilience related grants. And you can see us going after grants from the Department of Energy, FEMA. Some of it's administered through the state of Hawaii. And you can see in here where we've been successful and unfortunately where we haven't. But we've gone after over $600 million of federal grants to help us do the work that I just described and reduce the impact to our customers and allow us to do this work on as accelerated a basis as we can. So this is a quick summary here. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic back to Jason.
Thanks, Colton. Check. Thanks, Colton. Just to close with just one slide to give you folks the latest update on where we are with the litigation settlement. On November 1st and announced recently in a SEC filing we did an 8K, we, along with other defendants, the state of Hawaii, County of Maui, and others, entered into a settlement agreement. Really, technically, it's two separate agreements, one with the class plaintiffs and one with the individual plaintiffs. And as part of that, we agreed to pay, if approved by the court, our share, which represents just under half, 1.99 billion of the global settlement fund, including the 75 million we've already contributed to One Ohana. As I said in my opening remarks, customers will not pay a penny for the settlement. There is no bill impact if the settlement's approved. That's going to be completely borne by our shareholders and our company. Part of the agreement calls for 4 payments, equal installments annually. We did an equity raise recently to raise up $550 million in stock. We need to set that aside for the first payment. By the agreement, we need to put that into a set aside. And then finally, just briefly, that earliest that by the agreement we would make that payment is in late 25. And then just to be clear, there are certain legal steps and procedures that still need to, and conditions that need to be met for the payments to be made. So with that, I'll close. I hope we provided a responsive information and hope you got a lot out of the update from Colton. So I think we're ready to take questions, Chair, if you're ready.
Thank you very much, and thank you also, Colton, for that. Well, thank you all for that presentation, which hit almost exactly 90 minutes. This briefing is scheduled to go 3 hours at the maximum. We will open for question and answer after we take about a 5-minute recess so that everybody can take a deserved break. Recess. reconvening on this November 8th, 2024 informational briefing with Hawaiian Electric Company. So we've heard a presentation from HECO on their wildfire safety strategy, and I will now open it up for questions, and we'll begin with Senator Lee.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation, especially at this point. I think coming in is really helpful. I had just one, and I have to step out for another meeting, but looking at, I think, all the various different line level and other sorts of technology and strategies to implement to better be able to respond and identify and do all the things when there's disasters. I recently had an opportunity to go meet with a number of other companies doing similar things in other places, but more importantly, follow up with the regulators and the actual utilities themselves. And there seemed to be some stuff that wasn't covered here that maybe you're aware of, but one of them in particular was essentially, in concept, a similar sensor that's easily installed. You can literally just drop it in, run a drone, but does a lot of the same stuff that you're talking about, or actually all the same stuff you're talking about right now. Measures pretty much everything you need off of the line, including temperature and also vibration. So rather than just using wind speed as a determinant, as risk measure for when something might have an issue, it's able to actually tell you exactly what's happening on the line in real time. But the other thing that it does, interestingly, and I'm not an electrical engineer, so I'm not going to try and explain how it works or anything, and I don't frankly even understand, but essentially being able to identify down the length of a line, many, many miles long, by bouncing break-in frequency or something, that's undetectable otherwise, able to identify exactly where a break is down to like a pinpoint number of just feet. So you can deploy linemen and others to respond immediately. The last thing, which was kind of mind-blowing, it's able to measure the actual real-time line health and figure out exactly what the real load is and where the safety risk kind of threshold really is. And for a number of the places where we're talking about where these have been deployed, they're able to get as much as 40% additional capacity on transmission lines they thought, by traditional metrics and ratings had been already tapped out. And what's really fascinating about that for us, obviously, is we're trying to reduce cost and everything. Because of that, you're able to avoid having to build new transmission lines when you have existing ones that actually have more capacity than we imagined by in real-time monitoring it. And in particular in Hawaii, there have been, I think, over the last decade or so, I'm aware of at least 3 or 4 situations where different generation projects or storage or substations or whatever were either inhibited or had to be amended or whatever because of a lack of transmission capacity. And so even being able to save tens of millions of dollars, by not building additional transmission lines, that's one thing, but being able to site a generation plant or solar or batteries or whatever it is in a place that is just way cheaper, that an existing transmission line exists, that this additional capacity could potentially allow, could be huge and system-wide. I mean, that's like potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in savings, and for a handful of sensors that are, you don't even need them in place permanently. You can put them on, do it for a year or two, figure out what the actual real-world metrics are, and then put in the new project or whatever it is, measure it for a while, and then take them off and move it to the next thing. But is that something that you guys are aware of?
Yeah, we are. So Senator, that I think by description you're talking about sort of this new generation of advanced sensors that can do multiple things. It can aid a utility operator for a normal day. So what you talked about, additional capacity, something called dynamic line rating,
Right.
where it can take weather data, health data of a circuit to say, at this point in time, it's good for this much power, whereas a static rating is more conservative by its nature, may have a lower threshold, so you can actually eke out more use out of a line. But these advanced sensors, using a lot of the same sensing capability, can do things like do a down or broken conductor prediction or calculation, and a number of other things on top of that. That, we are aware of it. We actually submitted a grant application to the Department of Energy to deploy those technologies at scale on our system. We did that in conjunction with KIUC under a topic that the DOE allows only states and county governments to apply for. So the state of Hawaii, through the State Energy Office, was hospitable in facilitating that, allowed the two utilities to make that request. We do see a value in that. It's still a new technology, but we think if it can be proven, it can have an extremely useful role. And its role can still be useful even with the work that we talked about today, right? Even if we do covered conductor or undergrounding or reconductoring copper with aluminum reduces risk, doesn't eliminate that risk. And so if you have a line break, the down conductor or broken conductor technology can shut that circuit off faster. So we think it has a lot of value to us. We tried to get about $500 million of federal grants to help us with that because we think it can have an extremely useful role for us in mitigating risk in the future. Unfortunately, we were not selected for that. The DOE does have an additional almost $4 billion of funds appropriated under the GRIP program. We understand they're going to do a third GRIP tranche awards next year. So we're looking to make our application more competitive, but to use those technologies as well as part of our application. And I'll give you a call or an email if we need a letter of support, Senator, on that.
Happy to support. The one thing I just follow up on, thank you, Chair, is just as, at least the application that we were looking at per sensor was in the $8,000 to $10,000 range.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they're good for, you know, it's, why does you want to spread them? So even if we're not able to get a full system-wide massive deployment of what you might need, even in a limited application, even as like a pilot for a year or to supplement, you know, the other stuff that's currently in the plan, it just seems kind of like a no-brainer because it's almost like no cost in the scheme of things.
Understood, yeah.
So that's something that, is there a path for that?
Well, yeah, there's always a path for that. We're always, in fact, some of these devices that Kurt shared with you are things that are new to us, you know, that we didn't have a year ago. So we're always looking for the advantages of new solutions, new technologies to replace or substitute or just new for something that we don't even have today. And sensors are definitely a big part of it. What we're able to do is only as good as the data and information that our controlling devices have. And so getting greater fidelity, different kinds of sensing information done can make those decisions much, much more informed and better.
If it's helpful, I'd love to follow up offline.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I was kidding about the letter, but definitely open to having that discussion.
Well, no, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that is kind of mom and apple pie, so. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, members. Questions?
I have one quick question.
Vice Chair.
On the risk modeling slide, what is the first item listed, ETWR at 200 million?
In this slide here. So,
This is slide 49 in the presentation.
yeah, thank you. So the red line, the base case, is based upon something called an estimated total wildfire risk, or ETWR, of $300 million per year of total system risk of structure loss and acres burned from a wildfire, or from wildfires over the course of it. It may not just be one, it may be multiple. That's an estimate based upon the limited data that we have in Hawaii about wildfires and the sources and causes of those wildfires. Because that $300 million estimate was based upon an estimate, and we know we don't have as much data as we would like to have to do that estimate, we said, well, what if the risk is actually less than what we think, right? What if and this is inherent risk, not after you mitigate. what if the risk is $200 million per year? And that's what the yellow dots with the red circle represent, just a different scenario.
Okay, so in order to get within the 80% range, how would something like some new technology factor into the equation
Yeah.
if you added that type of scenario into your mix?
Yeah. So it's a great question, and I think it ties to what Senator Lee was speaking to. So this is a risk analysis and a risk reduction forecast based upon a set of assumptions on what different solutions we have at hand, what effectiveness they'll have, and what their costs will be. And because we're just starting that journey, we've had to make a lot of assumptions, and we don't have the ability to rely on a lot of actual data to inform these assumptions in the model. And so that is one really important reason why in the strategy we're developing, we're developing this strategy on the basis that we're not gonna just do it, file it with the commission in January, and then not do any more strategy planning work for the next 5 years. Right? We're gonna be doing this every single year. And so as new solutions come up, like a new technology that Senator Lee talked about, or we learn that undergrounding costs are different from the $11 million per mile assumption, or the effectiveness of covered conductor is different from the 80, I think it was 80-something% risk reduction we're assuming, then we'll update our assumptions, redo our modeling, and then adjust our plans accordingly. So we're always updating our plans and strategies for the latest information and latest options that we have. And so the filing that we're doing in January is just for this year. The commission has directed us and KIUC to do filings in January, but also to do annual filings every December 31st.
Okay, thank you.
If I may just ask a clarifying question
Yes.
to that answer. Just to confirm that the model that you're referencing in this chart was developed after Lahaina?
Yes, this model was developed in 2024. We have Philsinger Energy Partners, who's a company that advises many of the utilities on the mainland, have done similar model development work for large utilities like Xcel Energy, and advises important people like Governor Newsom, the state of California, around wildfire mitigation work from both the utility and state perspective. They actually helped us develop this model. It's still being tweaked, but this was developed this year.
Okay, thank you. And then at the beginning of and then throughout your presentation, you indicated $120 million, around $120 million spend in this year, calendar year, followed by a projected amount of about $300 million of spend over the next 3 years to facilitate the work. Your chart contemplates it looks like the majority of those scenarios contemplate a spend overall of upwards of $2 billion. The base case looks like about $2.25 billion. So I'm wondering what the function of time is in this chart?
Yeah, I think the question you're asking is, when do we get to that 80% goal, right? Like how long will that take?
Yeah.
So under the base case, with the information that we know now, because the model is telling us covered conductor is a key part of it, and us knowing outside of the model that we want to do some selective strategic undergrounding as well, that work is going to take about 10 years worth of work to do.
Okay.
Right, and it's not just a financial constraint, right? It's resources, it's permitting, it's getting materials, getting engineering done, working with the community to get that work done in their communities.
Thank you. Members?
Chair.
Chair DeCoy.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, thank you. You guys' site visit was super helpful for us in Maui. Really appreciate it. It reinforced everything that we saw. And I want to also thank you guys for, moving forward. You never lay idle. a lot of the questions that we asked, you guys had stuff in motion. So Senator Richards wanted to be here, so I wanted to ask his question, and hopefully he's listening right now, because I think you kind of covered it. Why copper versus aluminum? And if you can just say why, and I kind of text him back why, but
Yeah.
for the record, just.
Sure. So there's two reasons we are replacing the copper with aluminum. The first is because what we've experienced, what the industry has experienced over time, copper was a very common conductor material, but what the industry experienced over time is when that copper conductor is there for a long period of time, it becomes embrittled. So it can be very strong and perfectly fine when new, but over time, as it's subject to weather, as it swings continuously and bends a little bit with every swing of a span from a wind direction change or gust, it slowly over time becomes brittle, and then the corrosion just adds to that. And the fact that a lot of our copper conductor is just one solid piece of copper, meaning it's thicker, individually thicker, makes that brittleness and weakening more prevalent. So these are conductors that over time has become weaker, and we've seen that they begin to break. And so aluminum, although it's not as good of a conductor of electricity, the aluminum is lighter, so we can make it bigger. And then the common design, as you can see in all of those examples there, it's like rope, where it's made up of multiple strands threaded together, and that creates additional strength by not having one solid thick piece of aluminum. And that's why we're switching over from single strand or solid copper over to multi-strand aluminum.
Okay. Any better in prevention or suppression as well?
Prevention or suppression of a fault or
yeah.
ignition?
Yeah.
Only to the extent that aluminum is less likely to break
Okay.
and fall, right? And that's where the risk comes from, it being an ignition source. But in terms of itself, if a tree leans against a conductor, whether it's copper or aluminum, it can become an ignition source.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully you heard what you said, so thank you. I have a second question. I was looking at your vegetation management and your spending of the 6.3 million. Has that factored in areas where you folks have right-of-ways? And I believe some of those right-of-ways within our state lands, such as Olinda. Does that factor in those areas that now a bigger buffer needs to be set when the company goes in to clear? And the challenge that we've had is that in some of these areas where trees had to be cleared, it then brought up a lot of invasives. So, the fallback on some of those departments, I'll say DLNR, the ask will be, now we need funds to cover that. Do you folks have a plan to either put some kind of cover down on it so that the invasives doesn't come up? And is it the request later that the company will ask for a wider buffer? And have you considered in areas that you guys are already paying an easement fee? Is that in this breakout as well?
Yeah, so in the breakout, you're talking about in the spend to date?
Yeah, under the vegetation.
Yeah, so the
management.
vegetation work we've done to date has largely been continuing to trim within the limits of an easement or right-of-way. In some cases, like the photo here on the example on the right, where we were able to work with the landowner to trim further back and all the way down, that's really an exception. And the numbers that's on the table is largely a reflection of more traditional trimming, because every time we want to trim beyond what we have in an easement, and typically easement rights don't allow us to trim on the ground, right? We're generally allowed to trim only around our energized lines. And so we want to trim more, we want to get more of it done so we can have bigger clearances, but it requires us to get the permission from the easement or adjacent landowner in order to do that. And we've been trying to do that for hazard tree removal, more vegetation work, but in the numbers you see in here, it doesn't make up a large portion of that, because we haven't been able to do a whole lot.
So on the state properties, and again, you know, we looked heavily at Olinda,
Yeah.
you know, and upcountry, you know, it became apparent that to get to those lines, there was a lot of, you know, cutting. So the departments have asked, you know, where does that lie in fee, easement fees, yeah? And will that be renegotiated at that level?
Yeah, I'm sure that's going to be a discussion on our easements when those easement terms expire and when they have to be renegotiated. I think that's, I'm not in I don't work in that area, but from talking to those folks, I think that's already happening with landowners for easements where they, you know, in the last year, our easement leases have expired.
Follow-up question. So, Fulton, if you look at, as we start to transition into homes and that type of material, you know, we struggle already with the costs of affordable housing, you know, which, you know, all these added costs has just put us out and beyond. Some of these properties, and, you know, most of us as landowners that own our properties, and we like landscape, yeah. You guys ever came up with some kind of measure or a requirement or an ask of, you know, no grow your stuff underneath the utility lines going forward? I think that should be part of like the preventions going forward, because, you know, we see that so often, like, and I'm like, you planting that under there for, you know, and because, so in Avalau, in upcountry Maui, you know, as we told them, okay, we're gonna power shut off, you know, these trees continue to fall on those fall on the lines, and now they completely block one-way access in.
Yeah.
My areas are some of the most remote areas. You know, I want you guys to consider that, or at least kind of express that as well, because it has taken on toll on a lot of our residents that are old timers that need the medical attention. So, so I was hoping that you guys could address that as well, going forward, because I want to do that this year, address that even in legislation, part of fire prevention. And last, my last question is, on your camera systems, which thank you, because it helped us even on Molokai when that fire blew out. Have you guys worked with some of the other landowners, big landowners, to that also working on fire prevention, to utilize the same systems, or at least their properties to have the same cameras or something like that? Because when I spoke with DHHL, I think Jaren and we were having the conversation, because they want us to do monitoring, and I said, hey, try jump on this website, meet with you guys. Have you guys had that conversation yet?
Yeah, we have in two areas. One is we've worked with nonprofits and some landowners who had an interest in putting up their own cameras, and we've been able to work with them to put their camera in using the same technology that we do, and their camera becomes part of our network. And of course, they have access to that as well, right? So they benefit and we benefit and our customers benefit from that. We've also been working with some landowners where perhaps maybe they didn't have a strong interest in putting up a camera, but they own land in a place that's very, very opportunistic for placing a camera. We've been working with them on doing so. Not all landowners want to have one of our cameras there, but for those that have a willingness to actually have the discussions, we've been talking to them about it.
Thank you. Sounds good. Thank you, Chair.
Did you want to, the prior question about, you know, clearance of vegetation in individual residences, did you want to address that?
Yeah, only to say, I believe there was some past bills to try and address that. I don't think they were successful, but I'm not too close to it, but I definitely will take your suggestion and request back to the team to see what is appropriate for the 2025 session.
Thank you, Chair.
Members, questions? Chair Wakai.
Colton, I appreciate your effort and your team's efforts on trying to come up with a very thorough plan, and one that embraces technology to help get you to a better place. But we've been down this road before, I mean, 2019, you had wildfires on Maui. HECO put together it was called a resilience working group in 2019. Siemens came up with a report based on the working group's input, and everything in that report is exactly what you said should be done today. They talk about drones, they talk about vegetation management, they talk about sensors, they talk about cameras. All of these things were recommended to you in 2019. And then the Wall Street Journal report says that between 2019 and 2022, HECO spent a paltry $245,000 to mitigate and to effectuate any of these recommendations. Why should the public have any confidence in you and HECO to do any of the things you just mentioned today when your track record proves that you just sit on plans and really don't put into action all the things that you say you plan to do?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Chair. Appreciate that concern and that question. So first of all, the Resilience Working Group was a group made up of Hawaiian Electric and external stakeholders. It was looking at all threats, including wildfires. That was identified as one of the threats to focus on. But we were taking action on it, right? We had developed a resilience program with a lot of investments to do just that. That totaled about $200 million worth of investments across the islands, and that was put together, filed with the commission for approval, and that ultimately became an opportunity to ask the federal government to pay for half of it, and that's the $95 million we got from the federal government. Unfortunately, that process to get that program approved, to get the federal grants awarded, took longer than what we had hoped for. But we weren't just waiting for that. We weren't just saying, okay, we're not gonna do anything until we get the $200 million. We were spending over $20 million per year on vegetation management work. We have a number of FCIs installed, these sensors installed. We've been putting in these digital relays, like the photo I shared as an example. Our drone program, our company drone program, that picture that we showed you, those are employees. We've had a drone program and continue to build on that even before the wildfire on Maui. So that work has continued. It was going on before 2019, it continued after 2019. Unfortunately, the Wall Street Journal report, what they did was they just cited one specific category of work, and it's not to blame them. I think we're partially to blame for it as well, because the way we categorized it, that was the only thing that an outsider would look at and would see as this is being specific to wildfire work. But the reality was we're doing a lot of these things we're talking about in the presentation today, like vegetation management here, the inspections and all this other stuff. They just weren't in that line item, in that role that the Wall Street Journal article unfortunately focused on. So we've been spending millions of dollars before and even between the years 2019 and 2023.
Okay, so can you help me understand if the Wall Street Journal article was inaccurate, what's a good ballpark number as to how much you guys spent on mitigation post 2019?
So in that 2019, call it to 2023 period, right? I don't have the numbers directly in front of me, but I can follow up with the specific numbers. But our annual vegetation management investments have been over $20 million per year, every single year, across the islands. We've been putting in new poles, stronger poles to replace weaker ones every single year, right? And I think it's like over 1,000 poles per year, roughly. It varies year by year, but I can give you the specific 2019 numbers. Those are not in that line item that the Wall Street Journal looked at, but those are examples of what we've done. And you know, that typically runs in the $50 to $60 million per year for those pole replacements. I don't have offhand a recollection of all of the relays we replaced, the FCIs and other sensors we put in, the reclosers that we put in, all the other things that the Resilience Working Group and the report that we put together with Siemens identified as things to improve the resilience of the grid. But we've been spending a lot of money, even though we were still, you know, separately pursuing a separate program approval from the PEC, and that didn't happen until 2020. I'm losing my years. 2023.
Yeah, I think, Senator, if I may, but Thank you for the question. I think to Colton's point, it's somewhat a question of classification and how you look at it. But I think what I want to make sure that the committees and you all take away is, we are dead set focused on preventing wildfires. And the numbers we show you today, since August 23 through 24, are real numbers, real work, real quantities of doing our very best and to address wildfire risk, but also to engage at many different levels. The wildfire risk is really just not only a utility risk, right? And so we're doing our very best to partner to address it from a land management perspective, from a utility perspective, from an emergency response perspective. I can tell you, Kurt and his team, even before the fire, and that work probably wasn't classified as wildfire, we're doing helicopter work between Kahiava and Lahaina. In the weeks just before, we did a blog post on it. We were up there dropping in via helicopter to harden those lines with new hardware, right, between Kahiava and all the way through
West Maui.
Yeah, so I just want to emphasize, appreciate the question. I think we probably weren't tagging all our work as wildfire specific when that article came out. We are really trying to isolate resiliency work. Colton and his team have done incredible work engaging on what's the right thing to do for resiliency. We have more than wildfire to worry about, but right now we're hyper-focused on wildfire. We have hurricanes, we have lava. Kurt's brought some fire mesh, which I don't want to pick up, but don't bother, it's heavy. So I just I appreciate the question. I appreciate the concern of how do we prove it. I think we're proving it every day in the field with guys like Kurt and his crews. So thank you, Senator.
And I appreciate the response and HECO's work, but what troubles me is it seems like it's always outside forces that compel you to do what you're doing now. I mean, even like the renewable portfolio standards, that was the legislative pressure to have you go down the route of getting more renewables. It's always outside forces that compel you and your company to move in the public interest. And so, I mean, I don't know how many fires it's going to take for you guys to really get moving on these things. And you mentioned how you tried to do, Colton, you mentioned $20 million post 2019 on vegetation. I don't understand why you guys weren't spending more to do all the things that your Siemens report from the working group came up with. I mean, I look at the dividends you paid to your shareholders from 2019, 140 million, 146 million in 2020, 2021, 150 million, 2022, 155 million dollars you gave to your shareholders, when much of that money should have been put into doing the mitigation plans that you knew you had to implement in 2019, but you just waited for the Maui wildfires, and now all of a sudden you have a clear plan, you have specific figures on how much you're going to spend, but that should have been done a long time ago before the catastrophic fires in Maui in 2021, 2023. So why do you guys always have to wait for outside forces to do the right thing?
You want to take it? Yeah, let me go first.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so Chair, I appreciate that perspective. I would argue that we didn't just wait for the wildfires in Maui. Like I mentioned, I think this is our largest program ever that we've done at Hawai'i Electric, the resilience program work. Roughly 5 years work of investments, year over year, both capital and O&M, work to improve the resilience of our grid. That was something that we developed in conjunction with the stakeholders of the resilience working group, using the information that they shared, their perspectives. And we developed the program. We did the engineering, we did the cost estimating, we did the determination of what were the priority types of work to do. And all of that was done in that 2019 and 2021 timeframe that ultimately led to our application with the commission. So we didn't wait, and we were doing stuff. And a good portion, like in our transmission and distribution portion of our business, vegetation management work, the trimming work that happens, inspections and trimming for vegetation, that's the largest single line item in their O&M budget every single year, is to do that vegetation trimming. So we've been doing a lot. We've been doing a lot of other efforts to do more and enhance our vegetation trimming, not necessarily just for wildfire, but to reduce customer outages and damage to our equipment. So in working with the County of Hawaii after Hurricane Iselle, when we saw the devastation from the albizia, we worked proactively before we had another storm to work with them to remove albizas in areas outside of our right-of-way that we couldn't ever trim, to get them removed. And then to work with landowners like Kamehameha Schools to get their magic eucalyptus trees that grow really fast to be further away from our lines on the Hamakua coast. So we have been working proactively. I get what you're saying, that we should have done more, we should have spent more. I can tell you, like I mentioned at the very beginning, a third of our budget, of the budget to do everything in the company, all of the many things we need and have to and are asked to do every single year, a third of that budget is focused on wildfire mitigation work right now. And we're trying to mitigate that risk as quickly as possible.
Okay, all I'm trying to convey to, though, is that you had even more monies available to effectuate the plans you want to do today, but you gave it to your shareholders, to some, perhaps to the detriment of the public, because you chose to give your shareholders hundreds of millions of dollars instead of peeling back some of that money to the shareholders and putting it into all of the things that you're now trying to backpedal on and put into place. And I want to go back to that Siemens report, because it has a wealth of knowledge there. And it had a prioritization of critical threats to Oahu. Wildfire was number 11 on this list. More prioritized were hurricane, tsunami, flooding, cyber attacks, winds, fuel supply, earthquake, physical attacks. How are you going to pay for all of that mitigation when wildfires is number 11 on your priority list? What's the plan for all of those other 10 things that are higher priority to HECO?
So let me cover other resilience threats, and you can cover cyber and other things. So, Chair, I'm glad you pointed out, right? That's one of the big challenges that we have, every electric utility has, is that natural hazard threats are multidimensional, multifaceted. And every year, a utility like Hawaiian Electric has to determine to its best ability how to allocate its limited funds across the different threats that we have. Our focus prior, in terms of where the bulk of our efforts and investments were around the threats from high winds and flooding, because the hurricane threat to Hawaii is still a very, very significant threat. I think at Hawaiian Electric, and I think everyone in Hawaii, everyone in this room, we were surprised by the increase in wildfire risk over the last several years, and exemplified by the Lahaina and upcountry Maui wildfires. But that list of the different threats where wildfire was rated relatively low, that didn't come from us at Hawaiian Electric or by Siemens. That came from the first responders across the three companies, the emergency agencies, the Department of Defense, all of the different folks, the other utility infrastructure owners, all of the folks that were part of a working group. We collectively discussed the different threats, and that ranking reflects the collective thoughts and views of that. So I think it was the community at large, call it the emergency community at large, at the time we weren't really appreciating the growing wildfire risk that we face. And so we've made this pivot around focusing our resilience efforts around high winds and flooding to wildfire. The good benefit, and it's a trade-off we have to make every single day, right? Every single year when we're setting our budgets. The good news is that a lot of the things we're talking about, the fast trip, the operational changes, fast trip, block reclose, the hardening that we're talking about, cover conductor, undergrounding, those things will help us against a resilience threat from high winds, right? The enhanced vegetation work, the hazard tree removal, that all helps us against a high winds threat and maybe not so much flooding, but the effects that you typically or often see with storms and with hurricanes. So although we're focused on wildfire mitigation and we've been talking about the benefits to wildfire risk with this work, it does have other benefits to other hazards like hurricanes as well. But we do need to still make investments in the rest of our island or other parts of our islands where the wildfire risk is low in order to do the ongoing and necessary resilience and reliability work there to help us deal with other threats as well. That's for the natural hazards. And I'll pass it over to Jason to talk a little bit about cyber, because that is a very, very big threat that we face.
Thanks, Colton. Thanks, Senator. Like as we were mentioning there, and as you mentioned, there's a great list of resiliency threats that we face in Hawaii. I think Colton touched on most of them. Just from a cyber perspective, we do have a outsized mission as a utility compared to our peers, just because of the geographic density of critical defense facilities and our role in supporting Indo-PACOM and all the combatant commands. It's a job we take extremely seriously. It is increasingly challenging. Even as the elections went on the other day, we saw an uptick in attacks against our system. So we are investing in it. We do our very best, as we do with other things, to leverage federal assets and partnerships with the intel communities where we can, with different DOE labs and other organizations, national labs that provide us with sensing and intelligence and threat information. And we try to integrate that into our cybersecurity defenses. So, one thing is just being mindful, leveraging all of the available resources of the federal government and partnerships we can to try to bring down the cost of protecting the grid against cyber. But as you know well, in Hawaii, the electric utility has a big role in national defense in supporting all those bases. So I'll yield there. Thank you, Senator. Oh, can I follow up on an earlier question real quick? I'm sorry to distract. On the cameras, we're partnering with some landowners. You asked a question. One was KS, Commandment Schools, and the other is Queen Emma Land. So those are two of the ones we've been working with. Thank you.
I want to quickly ask one question regarding the global settlement, and you are on the hook for $2 billion. And Jason, it sounds like because of the sale of stock, I think you brought in $485 million, you're able to make the first payment. And then you went on to say that the ratepayers of Hawaii are not expected to help pay off any portion of this $2 billion judgment. Help me understand, after the first payment is done, how are you going to make the next 3 payments after that without affecting ratepayers?
Yeah, so we still need to work out all of our options to finance it, but we are not going to be asking for a rate increase directly to pay for that. It's going to come out of shareholders. You might mention dividends earlier. Shareholders invest in companies, in all companies. They assume a certain amount of risk, and they've certainly experienced that. We've yielded the dividends for the last several months. The market capitalization of the stock is down. We need to, we're going to need the legislature's support on policy that helps us strengthen financially to make investments in the grid. But yeah, we're going to be raising that through non-rate driven mechanisms. I think to the extent we get support and we can improve our credit rating, that it reduces the price of everything for ratepayers, just in our daily work. So yeah, I don't have an answer for you at the moment. We did raise the funds necessary to make the first payment. We will set that aside, and we are confident that we'll be able to raise the remaining as needed. That first payment's not due till 25, and as part of the agreement, we have to sort of shelter that for that purpose, Senator. Thank you.
Did I hear you correctly? So you're not expecting the ratepayers to help shore up your next subsequent payments, but you're going to ask the taxpayers to do that, because you're going to come to us legislatively to ask us for assistance to help you pay off the remainder of it?
No, we're not asking to help pay off anything. We're paying for the settlement, not 1 penny from ratepayers. I'm saying that, and I think we'll be able to share shortly, and you're seeing it in other jurisdictions, the risk of future wildfire, the speculative risk that one could occur, that a future catastrophic wildfire could occur. Just the mere speculation of it is causing credit rating downgrades on all utilities, and has nothing to do with the settlement. It has to do with financing we need to put infrastructure and poles in the ground. And the cheaper we can do that, the better for the ratepayers. And in California, Oregon, Idaho, I'm off the top of my head, I'm losing it. Almost every jurisdiction where there is a wildfire risk is considering measures to provide assurances to investors that they're not fully exposed on their own to that whole of society risk, which is wildfire, which is increasing, Senator.
Okay.
And we will present that in a far simpler manner, that we are contemplating and designing something where as we physically reduce the risk over time, we would return that back to ratepayers in the form of a fund. So I think we're not prepared today to talk about all the elements, but we heard all the feedback we got from you folks pretty loud and clear, trying to be mindful of the impact on rates in all we do, but also trying to be mindful of the risk ahead of us and the need to have a financially strong utility and provide property owners with some assurance as well, even for their own property insurance. So I'm sorry for rambling. We can get into it in detail in a future date, and I'm happy to meet on it as well.
Chair, if I can just add to what Jason said, just to give a little clarification. So your question was around the settlement. That has to do with the wildfire in August of last year and the litigation associated with that. That's the settlement, the 1.99 billion. That deals strictly with the event that happened in the past. And to make it extra clear, although we are funding the first installment with an equity issuance, and we have yet to determine how we're going to, what specific path, which option we're going to take to fund the remaining 3 payments. We're not asking Hawaiian Electric customers or Hawaii taxpayers to pay for it. The company and its shareholders will be paying for it, whether we do a further equity issuance or we do some kind of debt or even a sort of novel hybrid. Whatever the way we ultimately do it, we're going to be asking our company and our shareholders to fund that. For the future risk, which is around how rating agencies and others rate utilities like Hawaiian Electric, their rating of us is based upon what they see our perceived risk going forward, in addition to the risk we're under right now. And it's that future risk uncertainty and what that could be. Could it be very big? Would it be capped or limited? That is the function of a number of things that we do. A lot of the work we talked about today in our future plans to implement mitigations, that will have an impact. But things like creating legislation to establish a fund, like Jason was beginning to talk about, we can talk about it more later. Those are other efforts that are under consideration to help improve the perception and real risk that we are seeing in Hawaii as having on a going forward basis. So we talked about both. I just wanted to make clear that they're related, but they're actually separate.
Okay, yeah, no, and I think that's a reasonable legislative ask for that future mitigation. I just want to make sure that the taxpayers and the ratepayers are not going to be ponying up a dime of your $2 billion judgment.
That's right.
That's all on you.
Yeah,
Correct.
Okay.
for the record, and that's correct, not 1 penny.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
I'd like to follow up on that question. I believe it's been reported publicly that the federal mediator who guided the construction of that global financial settlement said essentially that the $2 billion portion that HECO is committed to pay is $2 billion because that's how much HECO can afford to pay. I believe that has been reported. That essentially, of the $4 billion, HECO's paying $2 billion because HECO can pay $2 billion and can't pay much more. The state share, it's been reported, of that $4 billion global settlement is $800 million. Despite the state attorney general saying multiple times that she's confident that the state's actual liability for the wildfires is low. And so what I thought the question was, and if that wasn't the question, it's my question now, how much of the $800 million that the administration is going to propose that taxpayers pay to fund that global wildfire settlement is intended to cover liability for HECO that the federal mediator said that HECO could not cover?
Thanks, Senator. First of all, from my perspective, we're not part of the mediation team or the lawyers here, but just to be perfectly clear, I don't share the perspective. I think it's a shared risk. I think the events are clearly laid out, and Hawaiian Electric's owning its part of it. To my knowledge, it has nothing to do with what we can or can't pay. And you're an attorney by study as well. You understand this settlement is not an admission of liability, right? We've agreed to settle to expedite payments to the people in need, and as parties, they came together and came up with this split. And we're owning our part of it. As far as how it was distributed or the motivations behind, I can't speak to that. And those things happened in confidential mediations that I wasn't part of. I view it as a disaster that had many, many contributing factors that didn't happen in incidents that happened over a series of unfortunate events in a very high wind situation, that there were multiple factors that led to it. And through mediation, this is the split that was agreed upon. To my knowledge, my personal knowledge, there's no influence on who could pay what, but I wasn't at the table. So that's the best I can answer for you. Yeah.
And I can appreciate that. And if you or anyone watching believes that that's an unfair question, then I can understand that as well. But I can assure you it's a question that will be asked of us.
Understood. I didn't say it was an unfair question. And I don't think it's unreasonable. That's the only answer I can give you. I wasn't, and I don't believe it was influenced by who could pay what. It's a function of mediation, to which I wasn't part of. Yeah.
Okay. Members, any other questions?
So,
Chair DeCoy.
thank you. So just as a follow-up, so you said you weren't at the table. Was anybody else from
Yeah,
Hawaiian Electric?
our legal team was. We're not part of the legal
Okay.
team here before you today.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Generally, engineers and IT folks aren't part of that team.
So, I just wanted to say this, and I know Kurt guys have been doing a lot of work in Maui prior to, and I think this is one of the questions I had asked when we did the site visit. I said, I was amazed that, we're going through COVID and the chain supply of just every company that had reached out for parts, name it whatever you want. I had asked you guys this question. I said, how did you guys get all these poles here, steel poles and everything, that fast? And I believe your response at that time to me was, this was already in the works. So it wasn't as if these things were purchased and got there right away, because, those steel poles that you guys put up, which was part of the hardening of the grid, and we know that on where the windmills are at, and you guys having to come over that ridge is huge, especially for the west side. So, I wanted to, what I didn't ask you was, what was the cost of investment prior to you guys bringing in those poles and having them right at the point when we needed to get Lahaina back up as fast as the team did?
Can I start? Yeah. So Chair, using the Lahaina example, what we deployed in restoring a critical transmission line that serves West Maui beyond Lahaina, that pole line that we visited was made up of both a combination of wood and steel poles. The steel poles were installed in a very specific section of it, where in discussions with the Lahaina community, the residents there felt that they wanted that section to be steel. Even though we consider that line as an interim solution until plans are figured out on what we're going to do with Lahaina, because it runs through Lahaina town, that we said, okay, we'll use steel poles to do it. And to the beginning of your question, we used steel poles that were originally planned to be installed in a different location, because that prior to the wildfire, that pole line was already there. But that those steel poles were ordered as part of our ongoing resilience work, right? To the point that I tried to make earlier, that we have been year after year working on resilience and using steel as one of the materials to replace existing poles that are not as strong, That was already in place. And we said, okay, let's use these steel poles for this purpose, which helped us do the work faster than if we had to order the poles, because it takes a while. So that's an example of where we did that. And just to kind of illustrate the whole example for everyone. The cost associated with putting in a steel pole versus a wooden pole, the incremental cost is probably in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, but the total cost to install a pole is really dependent upon the location that you're doing it, right? Whether it's up on a hill remote where you have to use helicopters, or whether it's right on the side of the road where you can bring your trucks right up there. So it varies tremendously. I don't know, I can get back to you with what it costs to do that section. But at least what I am familiar with is on Oahu, we have a different voltage. Our poles are taller, but our transmission poles on Oahu, when we're putting in a steel pole, you know, they'll be in the $500,000 or so range to put in a steel pole. Because a lot of our poles here on Oahu are pretty remote. They're up on the ko'olaus and they can get pretty expensive. I don't know if you have any specific costs to Lahaina. If not, we can provide it to you.
Yeah, at this time, I don't have that information as well, but I do appreciate the recognition of the work that we were doing prior. That's ongoing work that we were doing, so, but we could get back to you on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Members, questions? Okay, I have several, and then if other questions come to mind, I'm happy to recognize other members. If we can go back to slide 19. Can you just, I guess, clear it up for us? What are those are the two primary thresholds. I know you said that there are a number of factors in your matrix, but what are the wind, what's the
threshold?
Yeah, what's the
trigger.
threshold of how hard the wind has to blow?
Yeah.
And how low the humidity has to get, where you guys are red and then power goes out?
Yeah, I should have spent more time on this slide, so thank you, Chair. So in this example here, we set the threshold for wind gusts at 45 miles per hour.
Okay.
So you can see the red ones are at 51. The ones that are green in the wind gust column is 41. So it's either below or above that 45 mile per hour threshold. We also have a relative humidity threshold of 45%. So unfortunately, it's confusing because it's the same number, but this is a humidity level. And so if your humidity is above the 45%, you're in the green, like the 5 circuits at the beginning. If it's below 45% relative humidity, then you're in the red. And so you can see why those are green and red. The trigger for shutting off the power requires both of those conditions to be met. So your wind gusts need to be experienced above 45 miles per hour and at the same time experiencing relative humidity below 45%. And so in this example, these circuits that we're showing here, one of the two thresholds were exceeded, but both were not. And that's why on the right column, everything's green, where it says no, that the PSPS or shutoff criteria was not met.
Thank you. And just for reference, you and I live on the windward side.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that seems like pretty low humidity. The west sides are generally drier. This is a west side example.
Yes.
What is the average sort of expected? What is the average wind speed on the west sides of our islands and the average humidity?
Averages?
Like in the summertime or in the fall when we're really worried about this stuff.
Yeah, okay, so let me speak specifically.
Because this is an extraordinary event, which is why you're in the PSPS monitoring window, right?
Yeah.
But, so just for reference, what's normal?
Okay, so generally speaking, for the leeward sides of our islands, the period of late spring, just before summer, through October or so, are the periods of the year that are drier. And it's in those periods on the leeward side where the relative humidity begins to fall into areas that begins to concern us. And so we think of our PSPS season or wildfire season as generally being late spring to late fall. And over time, in talking to the National Weather Service, that period has actually gotten bigger. But during that period, relative humidity on the leeward sides, in probably averaging in the 40s, 50s, but it can swing very high when like you have rainy conditions like this week, and it can drop below 45% for extended periods. Fortunately, if you look at historical data, during those periods of the year, on the leeward side where the humidity is lower during these months of the year, we do not have a lot of number of occasions in which the wind speed and wind gusts exceeds the thresholds that we've established. So there's plenty other times in the year where we see a lot of times where winds above 45, a lot of times in the year where the humidity is below 45, but when they're together, not too often. But you need that kind of combination of the two really to raise the risk of our utility infrastructure becoming a source of ignition. And so that's why we use those two. So I think in talking to the National Weather Service guys, we don't have a lot of red flag warnings per year. Some years we have nothing. In 2023, I think we had 2. In some years prior, I think we had up to 5 per year. But the combination of the extremely high winds that we got in August 7th and 8th of 2023, and the low humidity, they said they haven't seen that combination like in 20 years of looking at this, right? It's a very rare event. But even though it's rare, if it becomes a source of ignition in a wildfire, we want to make sure we're prepared to deal with it. And so we have these thresholds, we have a PSPS program. Even if it's very, from a probability standpoint, likely that we will have an event and have to shut off power, we want to be prepared in the event we encounter that situation.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. What's coming to mind from that answer is it seems like the more volatile criteria of the two would be the winds.
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's the one that's a little bit harder to predict and forecast. One thing to add, I know it's not part of your question, Chair. These criteria, the thresholds of 45 and 45, is based upon our folks and folks that are assisting us walking these lines, doing these inspections of the infrastructure to confirm the condition of them, mitigate anything that we needed to address, but these thresholds are based on that. Over the course of time, as we do more hardening, as we install things like covered conductor, we believe we can raise these thresholds, especially the wind threshold. So if we harden a circuit with covered conductor, maybe the threshold won't be 45 miles per hour for the circuit, maybe it will be 50 or 55. And even a 5 mile per hour increase in threshold significantly reduces the probability and the number of occurrences when you exceed that. So that's how these kinds of operational things and then the grid hardening work that we talked about go hand in hand.
Okay.
Just, if I could add, Chair, just adds to just speaking to the complexity, right, of operations and even just the microclimates, and hence why the further deployment of weather stations, because of just the dynamics that is involved valley to valley, that we are monitoring to meet these, to watch for these benchmarks and these targets.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's easy to understand when you think about the top of a ridge versus the bottom of a valley when there's a storm.
Or valley to valley.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Another follow-up question about pole replacements. I marked down slide 35. You mentioned that the to be determined part of your presentation out past 2026 is in part because you haven't completed inspections of, I guess, all of the poles on all of your grids. And I'm wondering how far along that the assessment is and when you expect to be complete and be able to provide the rest of the information on this. chart.
Yeah, so broadly speaking, Chair, inspections so far have been focused on the areas of the highest risk, so that the red areas. For Oahu, we're moving on to the medium risk areas to do inspections, and we're going to identify additional poles in addition to what you see in this table here that we might want to upgrade. On Maui, I believe we're still inspecting the highs, and we're going to continue.
We're wrapping that up and we're moving
Moving
into
to
next
two-
year.
yeah,
as
so
well
they're-
as Hawaii Island.
So they are moving into the medium risk areas as well. So when you go back, right, using Maui as an example, right, you look at the map, they're wrapping up inspecting the red areas, but they still need to start and are beginning to start inspecting the yellow areas. And the yellow areas for Maui County are pretty big, and so there's a number of additional inspections we need to do. It's very likely to identify a number of additional upgrades.
Pretty steep by the look of it as well.
Yeah, and Big Island maybe is an example of where we have very, very large areas within that medium risk tier. So even though we're beginning to do those inspections in 2025, forgot what year we're in, we probably won't be able to complete inspections of all the yellow areas just in 2025. It may spill into 2026.
And for those of us that live in lower risk areas of the state, can you give us some assurance that you do intend to move into inspections of those areas?
Yes.
By when?
Yes. So thank you for asking that question, Chair. So what we talked about today was just focused on inspections for wildfire risk mitigation work. We have general inspections of for example, the poles you referenced, pole inspections for all of our poles, all parts of every island, not just in the high wildfire risk areas. And in different counties, we have different cycles, but they generally range from 7 to 10 years of a cycle. So we'll inspect a pole every 7 years or every 10 years, depending upon the county and depending upon what we find. Right, so if an inspection that we do on Namoku Street, where I live in Kaneohe, they came by recently, they may tag a pole that says, okay, this is a pole that we don't want to wait for the next cycle. We want to address it immediately, or we want to address it in the next 2 years. Then we'll go and do that pole replacement. We won't wait. It may not need to be done today, but we won't wait for the 7 years from now to replace it. This inspection now will give us the information to say when we should replace it by. So that cycle, that cadence of 7 or 10 years is something that happens throughout our territories.
So the schedule for low risk areas is not going to be impacted by the plans you have here. It's unchanged.
As of this moment, we haven't fully determined what changes, if any, we want to make for the low risk areas. And I say that, and it feels a little wishy-washy, but we have to keep in mind that the red, yellow, and gray, the high, medium, and low risk areas, we created these distinct categories for the purposes of prioritizing work and illustrating what we're doing. The reality, it's all analog, right? The levels of risk doesn't fall into these neat categories. So there might be areas that are classified as low risk areas where, based upon what we see, outages we experience, if there are any ignitions that have occurred, any operational issues we see, that we may do enhanced vegetation work or enhanced inspection even in low risk areas, because even though it's in that low category, it may be very high in that low category. It may not be all that different from a medium circuit. Because every circuit has a different level of risk, and these buckets are somewhat artificial in how we categorize it.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yeah, it does. Members, any other questions? Okay, if not, I have just one more, which is, I don't know if the slide is at the beginning, but it was a reference to the encroachment of vegetation from adjacent private property into rights of way.
Yeah.
My understanding is that, at least for large landowners, August 2023 wildfire event has significantly changed their risk calculation as it relates to liability for fire. But that's a sort of organic reaction to what has happened. And you mentioned that in the different counties, there are ordinances. I guess on Maui, there's one requiring vegetation management by order of the fire department. What are some actions that you believe are necessary that policymakers might need to undertake at the county or state level to accelerate the type of vegetation management that you think is necessary to facilitate this strategy?
I'll start and you guys can jump in. I think what would really help the residents of Hawaii, not just utility customers, is to establish, call it an ordinance, right, requirements that and give authority to the appropriate agency that works with organizations like Hawaiian Electric, nonprofits, other utilities, to identify what areas on different parcels of land, whether it be government or privately owned land, where vegetation is becoming a risk to causing an ignition of some sort, as well as vegetation that may cause an accelerated spread of a fire, right? So it's ignition and spread. And that agency or agencies that have that authority working with others, if they could then have that authority to require a landowner, a property owner, or steward of a property to make corrections, make those risk reduction measures, fire break, cutting back, whatever it might be, putting in native species that are less likely to become a fuel to a fire, or if they are, they burn slower. Those things are all, I think, things can be helpful to us in Hawaiian Electric for sure, but it'll be helpful to KIUC, it'll be helpful to the DOT, it'll be helpful to many folks who have risks of their land or their infrastructure becoming a source of ignition and then also impacting their lands, right, through burns.
Thank you. If there is nothing else, then we'll adjourn this briefing.
Brooke?
Oh, Chair DeQuick, go ahead.
So I'd just like to follow up on that. The federal government used to have this program with fire prevention, fire risk, and it was in a partnership in this case in Maui County, that these landowners, whether they were farmers or ranchers or big landowners, could apply for. It would be inclusive of a fire training. We call that backburn.
Mm-hmm.
And it literally forced you, because it also became a food safety issue in regards to erosion and runoff. Something like that I would say our congressional delegation, that time the late Senator Inouye spearheaded it, and those funds made it possible for more of the bigger landowners at that point to help contain and then to prevent, whether it be cattle feces, to run off into the neighbors that would cause contamination to crops. These are some of the things that we would have worked in collaboration with the counties.
Yeah.
And I think this would be really helpful for us to reinstill that, or if you folk continue to seek these federal grants in collaboration with your fire preventions and mitigations, can be super helpful. The other thing I would like to just share with you folks, we all get the uncle and that auntie, or maybe the spouse, that become pack rats. And,
Or wives.
or wives that own the black and yellow containers that get everything that you need. So, I think it's super helpful for those of us to learn to purge, and, because it then also becomes part of, what we end up dealing with. And, I think this was super helpful for me as well. But, having programs like these that we've partnered, I think can prevent future stuff like this from hoping never to happen again. So if you have the opportunity, try look into that, because I think I'm gonna start looking into it as well, how we can bring those things back with some of our county partners and working with the fire department as well for training exercises.
Yeah.
So thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? As a follow-up item, I will be requesting if you can provide us maybe just some percentages on the pole replacement status, you know, how far along you are. I know you said on Maui, you're almost done with the high-risk category, but you can just provide us some follow-up information on how far you are along in each of those categories and when you project to be complete with your assessments and complete with your installation. And I'd like to take this moment again to thank you and my co-chairs for allowing us to convene this informational briefing and for your work providing all of the updated information, including the numbers. A lot of that information is what we've been asking for, and so this has been very informative and helpful. So thank you very much. And on that, we are adjourned. Thank you.